Well, good morning again, and welcome to today's session on people analytics in HR. Just a quick introduction to get started. My name's Katie, and I look after the marketing for UK and Europe for HiBob. If you're not familiar with HiBob, it's a HR and people management platform that's really focused on the employee experience, and it helps you to back any HR decisions or people decisions that you make with real data. People analytics are obviously a huge part of what we do and will undoubtedly play a really large role in the future of HR. However, we know that recently people analytics is being bounded around as a bit of a buzzword, and it can often lose some of its meaning. So today we're really happy to introduce you to Adina Lederhendler, who is our resident HiBob data scientist. And Adina is going to take you through the basics of getting started with analytics and using data that actually matters. So we'll just hand you over to Adina, who can give you a bit of a background on her expertise and explain what a data scientist actually is. And then we'll go straight into that crash course in people analytics. And if you do have any questions throughout the session, I'm hoping on your screens you'll be able to see an option for typing those in. And then at the end of the session, we'll answer as many of those questions as we can. And any that we don't get to today, we will follow up with you on email. So I'm just going to switch over my screen for Adina, so you bear with me a second. So Adina, it's over to you. We can see your screen.
Okay, great. So thank you, Katie. I'll just say a few words about myself. So my name is Adina, and I do people analytics at Bob. And I was asked to give an introduction to people analytics and how to use it effectively within your organization. So I'd like to go through the outline of the talk. It's divided into three parts. First, I'll talk a little bit about what is people analytics and how it can be used, and then go through a little bit about data and data collection. And then finally, I'll spend most of my time giving use cases, actual examples of how people analytics can be used. So what is people analytics? People analytics is a tool for gaining insight about your employees and your organization through data. When it's used efficiently, people analytics can help your organization to solve problems and make decisions by providing data-based insight. It can shine a light on areas that you might not be aware of, where your people function might need work. It can provide insight by combining different types of data, and it can overcome bias in decision-making, where we often, when we're following our gut instinct when making decisions about our people, we use a lot of non-factual information, and having analytics just to look at and back us up can cut through some of our bias. And finally, it helps us to convey clear messages to decision makers within the organization. Now, the most important thing really that I want to say here is that analytics don't make decisions. They only provide the necessary information to make them. And I'm showing an example here to the right that comes from one of the examples that we'll go into more depth about later, where we have here a sample output for a flight risk analysis, where we have an employee, Alice, with an output of a high risk for flight risk for turnover, and we have contributing factors that contribute to that high risk. Now, while this information is very interesting, it doesn't constitute a decision or a prescription for action. And it's really up to a decision maker such as Alice's manager or HR to decide, A, whether this information is really relevant in this particular employee's case, and if so, if any action is required. So, data collection. Once we've decided to go, oh, sorry, I think I missed, okay, so sorry. So if we want to use data analysis in an effective way to help our organization, then it's useful to define a process of how to use it most effectively. The first and most important step, I think, is to ask a specific question. If you don't have a specific question in mind when you go into this process, it's very easy to get lost, and it's very easy to spend a lot of time doing analysis that will ultimately not actually help your organization at all. Step 2 is collecting data relevant to the question. So having a question in mind will help you to decide which data you actually need. The third step is to analyze and visualize the data, and this is the only step where really some specialized knowledge and technical proficiency is required. And if you don't have a people analyst on your team, then it might be that you need to use an external tool or even a consultant to help you with this step. But then once you have the analysis, then the next step is to choose a small number of main takeaways from the analysis results. And in this step, what is really required is a strong familiarity with your specific organization and specific circumstances. And it often can't be performed by the same person that did the analysis in the first place. And this is a place where it's very important to have the context of the viewpoint of what it and the ability to decide what is important to take away from the analysis. Then the next step is to share your findings with decision makers. It could be HR and it could be management. Very often, people analytics and analytics in general stop at the point where you have a nice graph and it's not taken any further. But if you really want to feel that this process is helping, then it has to go further than just creating the results. And then once you've shared the findings, then the next step is to attribute actionable tasks to each summary point, and then finally to revisit and reassess the data after improvement actions have been completed. So now we'll get to data collection. So once you've decided on your question and what it is that you want to analyze, then you have to decide what kind of data you need. And there are lots of different types of employee data that you can use. There's basics like employee demographics or job information, such as title or seniority, things like compensation and time off data, which is usually fairly easily accessible. Then there's data such as survey data or performance reviews that requires a little extra work for collection, but it's also usually part of your organizational cycle anyway. And then there's external data such as salary benchmarking or other external market analysis that, depending again on what your question is, you can decide whether that's relevant or necessary. Before you start collecting data, there are several things that you should consider. This is not necessarily comprehensive, but I put together a few areas where it's important to think about the data that you need. So the first is data structure. So think first about which data fields you actually need to answer your question, and then which values can each field take. It's also important to think about whether you want to make each field mandatory, and take into consideration that if a field is not mandatory, it means that you won't have it available for all your employees when you do the analysis. And so some employees will have to be left out of the analysis, and you have to think about whether that's okay in the context. And finally, try to avoid free text data wherever possible, and prefer a closed list of values, just because it makes the analysis that much harder when you have a lot of free text. The next aspect is historical data. So do you want to focus on the current value for each employee, or is historical data also important? So for example, if we're looking at compensation, so are we interested in the current salary for each one of our employees and looking at the distribution across the organization of pay? Or are we more interested in looking at trends over time about how salary changes for our employees, in which case we definitely do need historical data. The next aspect is global data. So some organizations have multiple locations in different geographical regions, and different data might be relevant for different geographical regions. And even if a certain type of data is relevant, they might have different values for different sites. And then finally, there are regulations in different countries about employee data and data collection. And so that's also something that you need to consider, and how that will ultimately affect your ability to do the analysis that you want. And finally, scope. So who do you want to collect this data for? Is it all your employees? Is it some sort of subset? Do you want to review just current employees or include past employees as well? And are you including contractors, interns, part-time staff? All this is something that you should have a good feel for before you start actually collecting the data, so that you don't get stuck with partial data that doesn't help you to reach your ultimate goal. And then once you've decided what it is that you want to collect, so you should consider which data sources you want to utilize. I've mentioned external sources, so salary benchmarking or measuring market demand for specific roles. Classically, employee data is collected by HR personnel, and usually manually and entered into HR systems. But something you might want to use is having employees provide their own data through self-service systems like Bob, or surveys or forms. And that's something that has the advantage of allowing employees, first of all, a transparency, and also giving employees control over what they want to share with the organization. And so that's why at Bob we usually prefer this type of data collection. And then finally, passive measurement is a methodology for data collection that's gaining popularity over the past few years, where you collect data about employees using things like digital badges that record employee actions and other kinds of measurements, or using email or other communication analysis. So passive measurement, like I said, it's gaining popularity, but it does come with some serious privacy issues and transparency issues. So it's something that you should think about carefully before implementing. So, so now I want to go through some examples about how people analytics can be used. And I have 3 fairly short examples and one more, a little bit more in depth. So the first example I want to give is using people analytics to help address diversity of ethnicity or gender. Sample questions that we might ask would be, what is the representation gap across the organization or within specific departments? What's the pay gap? And we want here to be able to adjust for factors such as job type, experience, and tenure. What's the opportunity gap? Are members of all groups being promoted equally? And what's the turnover gap? Are all members of the groups leaving in equal proportions? And if not, does that mean that we have some kind of problem? So once we've chosen our question, then we can go collect relevant data, and really almost any kind of data can be relevant to these types of questions, where obviously we would have to collect data about the gender and ethnicity of our employees, and whatever other factors we think we need to look at. So here we have an example where I've chosen to look at female representation, both overall within each department and as a percentage of promotions. And so what we see in our graph is that For example, in the R&D department, women are 28% overall of employees and received 5% of promotions in the past year, whereas in the sales department, women make up 61% of employees and 71% of promotions. Sometimes you might have missing data or not enough data to perform an analysis. So for the marketing department, for example, while we have data about overall representation, there may not have been enough promotions to really calculate representation. So, and that's fine to have partial data. We just have to make sure that it's clearly communicated. And so the next step is to choose some key takeaways from this analysis. And this is just an example. Like I said, choosing the takeaways is really something very subjective, and it requires a lot of knowledge and context. So for example, what you might take away from this analysis would be to say that female employees in both R&D and product departments have significantly lower promotion rates relative to overall representation, or to say that overall female representation is lowest in the R&D department and highest in marketing. The next step would be to choose possible actions. So you could choose to discuss results with management of the R&D and product departments to better understand the underlying issues, and having the numbers to back it up really helps with these kinds of discussions. Another possible action would be to create leadership training programs aimed at women in these departments, or to interview managers to identify female employees who might have been overlooked for promotion. And then finally, like I said, you'd want to go back perhaps the next year and see if any progress has been made. The next example I want to give is from the area of efficiency, or using analytics to look at collaboration and working patterns within the organization using methodology called organizational network analysis. So sample questions in organizational network analysis are: how do people work together within the organization? Or where is there a high or low cross-team collaboration or cross-department collaboration? And finally, who are the key individuals other employees rely on to get work done? And really the goal of this type of analysis is to get a good understanding about how things work within the organization rather than how they're structured formally. Collecting relevant data for organizational network analysis, you can really go one of two ways. The first is to use surveys to ask employees directly who they work most closely with. And the second is the passive approach, where you would analyze communication data such as email or Slack to map out collaboration patterns. And this, like I mentioned before, is something that requires a little bit of consideration in terms of privacy and transparency. Now, once you've collected the data, the analysis consists of mapping out the organization, like in this visual. And then, depending on the question that you chose, to use statistical tools to identify key results. Here I've chosen to highlight the focus on individual roles within the network, but depending on the question that you asked, you might look at how departments are connected or different teams are connected within the organization. So at the individual employee level, the key takeaways in this specific example would be that employee A represents a vulnerability because they're a sole connection point for other employees within the organization. And that means that, first of all, employee A may act as a bottleneck, which can be a problem efficiency-wise. And second of all, if employee A leaves the company, then other employees are at risk of feeling disconnected from the rest of the organization. Employee B has a different role. Employee B acts as a hub, meaning that they have a lot of connections within the organization, and they are likely to play a central role in many processes and projects. Employee C acts as a broker, which means that they connect parts of the organization that otherwise are disconnected from each other, and they're likely to have a unique perspective because they hear from people from different parts of the organization and not just from a very interconnected internal network. So possible actions for these takeaways would be to try to create alternative connections for employee A's network to the rest of the organization. to bring employee B's role to the attention of management to make sure they're receiving proper recognition, and consider including employee C in decision-making processes to diversify opinion and drive innovation. The last short example I want to give is using people analytics to dive into employee engagement and satisfaction levels. So sample questions here would be which subgroups of employees are most or least engaged within the company, or what are the issues that our employees are most concerned about. And collecting relevant data for this type of analysis is straightforwardly using surveys to ask employees how they feel. That's really the best way to gauge employee sentiment, I think. And here we have an example where once you've collected the data, the analysis consists of aggregating and summarizing the individual responses. And so here I've chosen an example where we've taken open questions from a survey and used topic analysis to aggregate the different answers, different topics that employees mentioned in their responses. Open questions and surveys are sometimes really gold mines of information because they allow employees to communicate about really anything that's on their mind and not something that was specifically asked. And so that it's a very, very strong tool to use. On the other hand, reading through hundreds of responses to open questions can be very, very tedious, very difficult, very distracting. It's very hard to make sense of them when you're reading through lots and lots of them. And that's why topic analysis is a very good way to get to the bottom of what is actually going on with these kinds of responses. Basically, what it means is that you choose, you predefine a list of topics, and then you tag each response with the relevant topics. In Bob, we have an algorithm that does this automatically, but you can also, theoretically, you could also do this manually. And then once you have the tagging, then you can summarize and aggregate for each question what are the top topics that employees discussed in their responses. And in this example, there were two questions, two open questions in our survey. What are the things we're doing right, and what can we be doing to improve? And if you're using an algorithm, you can even just look at the top 5 topics for each one of these questions and already gain some kind of understanding and feeling about what employees are happy about and what they are less satisfied with without even reading the detailed responses themselves. And so key takeaways from this kind of analysis might be that employees are happy overall with office environment and work-life balance, and they would like most to see improvement with leadership and management as well as communication. So possible actions would be to discuss results with management and brainstorm ideas for improvement, to create a follow-up survey asking more specific questions about areas of improvement. So what specifically about leadership or what specifically about communication would you like to see improvement with? And finally, we can use the answers about what employees are satisfied with to help us create employer branding materials, highlighting the area where employees are most satisfied and things that set us apart as employers. And finally, I want to take a slightly deeper look at one example. I won't go into anything too technical or mathematical, but I do want to show you some of the considerations that go into choosing a methodology for performing advanced analytics. And so what I chose to talk about is flight risk prediction, or using people analytics to predict employee attrition, which is kind of a classic problem in people analytics that's discussed very often. But I haven't seen many cases where it's really gone into the details of how this can be achieved. So sample questions would be, what are the factors that most closely correlate with voluntary turnover, and which of our employees are most at risk for voluntary turnover? In order to collect the relevant data, so the thing that's most essential is to have data about past employees who left the company, including voluntary or involuntary tagging. Without this, really, you don't have any basis to perform this analysis. It's the most important thing to know. After that, what you need to do is to choose factors that you want to test. So these things have to be available for current and past employees in order to perform the analysis and to perform prediction. And they can include anything from demographic data through job history, performance data, survey data, anything that you think might be relevant for predicting turnover. So once we've collected the data, the simplest approach that we would want to take is to divide our past employees into two groups: a bad group of employees that left voluntarily and a good group of employees that did not leave voluntarily. And then for each of our selected factors, we would like to calculate how much each factor correlates with the probability of voluntary turnover. And so, for example, we might get results such as employees under 25 are twice as likely as employees over 25 to quit. And we can do this for any of the demographic or job-related or survey-related factors that we collected. Now, there are several problems with this simple approach, and two main ones. The first problem is, I'm showing here an example where we have 4 employees. Employee 1 and employee 2 both left the company. So in our simple approach, they would both be tagged as bad or put into the bad group. However, employee 1 stayed at the company for 2 years and employee 2 stayed for 5 years. And that's something that the simple approach simply just doesn't know how to take into consideration. And the risk of the flight risk for employee 1, I would say, has to be considered higher than for employee 2 in order for our model to be effective and not biased. The second problem, we see employee 4, who started at the company 1 year ago and hasn't quit yet. And so we would put them in our analysis into the good category. However, it could be that 6 months into the future, employee 4 is going to quit. And our model simply doesn't know that because we don't know that. We don't know what will happen in the future. And so we will assume that employee 4 is good. And all of the attributes, demographic, job-related, otherwise, of employee 4 will go to strengthen the prediction that that employee will not leave. And that is definitely a problem in terms of how well our model is going to be able to learn how to predict turnover. So basically, the simple approach does not consider either how long before employees quit or possible future events. So how can we overcome this kind of bias? And the answer comes from survival analysis, which is a type of analysis that originated in medical studies, where you want to follow patients and categorize different kinds of outcome. So it could be a relapse of a disease or even death. And then you want to compare two groups of patients, the patients with a bad outcome versus the patients with a good outcome, and look at the correlation with different risk factors, for example, smoking. And what survival analysis does is it breaks down the comparison by limiting it to a specific time frame. So in our case, doing survival analysis means that we would compare, first of all, we would compare the group of employees that left voluntarily after 1 month versus employees that survived in the company more than 1 month. And then we can repeat the same comparison for 2 months, 3 months, etc. So how does this help us with our problem? So let's look back at employee 1 and employee 2. So employee 1, you'll remember, quit after 2 years, and employee 2 quit after 5 years. So when we get to do the comparison of the employees that left voluntarily after 2 years, employee 1 is going to be in the bad group, and employee 2 is going to be in the good group, because employee 2 survived more than 2 years. But then when we get to compare the employees that left after 5 years, then employee 2 is going to be in the bad group, and employee 1 is not going to be in either group, because they don't have a history that's 5 years long. And so what this approach allows us to do is always to be comparing apples to apples. With employee number 4, this completely solves our problem, because as you remember, employee 4 only has 1 year history within the company. So when we get to employees that left voluntarily after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, etc., employee 4 is going to be in the good group because they survived more than 1 month, 2 months, etc. But once we get to a history of 1 year or longer, then employee 4 is simply going to be excluded. They're not going to be in either group because they don't have a history longer than 1 year in the company. And that solves our problem of not being able to look into the future. And so survival analysis in that sense provides, on the one hand, a very simple solution, but also very effective way to overcome the bias that we saw before. So, like I said, it's a very simple solution. The part that's not so simple is how to combine all of these separate comparisons into one single outcome. And that's the part that's maybe a bit more technical or mathematical, and I'm not going to go into that. But basically what you do is to combine all of the 1 month, 2 month, 3 month observations. And what you get is 2 types of outcome. The first is risk factors. So for each factor that we chose, we're able to calculate the overall additional risk. So for example, and these are made up numbers, but this is exactly the kind of output you would get. You could say each additional year of age reduces flight risk by 1.5%. Each additional dependent reduces flight risk by 5%. Employees who have recently changed managers have 10% increased flight risk, and etc. for all the factors that we choose to test in our model. And then once we have those, then we can apply them to an individual employee. So for each individual employee, we can take their age and their number of dependents and their manager status, and we can combine those together in order to produce an overall flight risk. And in our case of our employee Alice, she has a high flight risk, and not only are we able to give the overall risk, we're also able to say which of the factors contributed most to the overall risk. So we're able to say that she got this high score because she had a recent manager change, because she's between age 20 and 30, and because she's had no time off in the past 6 months. So possible actions from these results might be to be proactive by approaching at-risk employees and providing incentives, or to track risk trends over time. So the key takeaways that I want to highlight again is that you should try to use people analytics to inform decision making, and not to think that people analytics provide decisions or solutions in themselves. Always start with a specific question, and if you don't know what question you want to answer, so use the time first to think about what are the issues or what are the things that you think need improving. And then finally, to choose a small number of main takeaways and take action. Okay, thank you. Katie, so back to you, I think, for questions.
Great, yes, thank you very much. Such an interesting discussion, and it was great to see the sort of the process that you took us through, really. I mean, the importance of defining the end goal, the idea of choosing some specific questions, and really knowing what you're going to do with the data in the end, I think is relevant for all of us. And we have had some questions come in throughout the presentation. The first one being, what would you recommend as a really good first step for people wanting to introduce data into their HR?
So like I said, the first step is to think about what are the issues that you want to address, to think about specific questions. Make a list. Like, don't even think, first of all, about how you're going to do it or what data you're going to do. First of all, just think about what are the things that you want to solve. And then the next step is to think about, can we collect relevant data? How are we going to collect the data? How are we going to do the analysis? Is it something we can do in-house, or do we need some external help for that? But really, the first step is just to think about what are the things that we want to address.
Great, thank you. And then we also had another one around the flight risk analysis that you went through as an example. And the question is, how can the flight risk analysis help to reduce employee churn?
So like I said, the analysis itself is not a solution. It's only giving us tools and information to start solving the problem. And so the way that we could use this analysis in order to reduce turnover is to use the analysis to identify the employees that are most at risk, and then to think about, together with those employees' managers, to think about whether or not those employees are employees that we want to retain, and if so, what kind of incentives can we use. Sometimes we can also gain some insight from the contributing factors. So in the example that I gave for the employee Alice, one of the contributing factors was that she hadn't had any time off in the past 6 months. So that can give a clue as to something that might help, because if her manager goes and says, listen, it looks like you might need some time off, why don't you take a vacation, then that in itself can be something that will help reduce her risk.
Great, that all makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much. Well, we have two more questions. The next one is, could you recommend or talk through any alternative, non-traditional sources that could be used for data collection?
So like I said, I personally prefer any type of data collection that is done directly through employees. So having employees enter their own data is really the most transparent way. So I think use of surveys is very important. I think that having a system where employees can provide data about themselves, it could be, and it doesn't have to necessarily be only conventional things. You can ask employees to enter things about their skills or hobbies or preferences, and you can have employees enter data about how they like to work and collaborate, and again, really depending on the question that you want to answer. So the methodology that I personally prefer is the direct way. As I said, there are lots of ways that companies now collect data in more unconventional ways. I mentioned digital badges or sensor data. Sometimes you have employees have badges that they use to clock in and clock out, and they can collect a lot of information about working hours and stuff like that. Emails, communication, calendar data often is used in order to analyze productivity and possibly employee overload. All these things are things that are gaining popularity and use, and it just has to be used with caution in terms of privacy and transparency to employees.
Great, and I think a really nice question for us to finish on. We've had some other questions also, a lot kind of around the specifics of what you can actually use the Bob platform to do in terms of people analytics, and how you can use the surveys and the reporting functions that Bob has to get started with your people analytics and to follow it through. So we will include some tips around using Bob for people analytics in the follow-up to this webinar. But just to finish, Adina, a great question we've had is what do you think the future of people analytics within HR is, and will it ever replace the idea of a people-based HR team? Will we turn into robots?
Okay, so what is the future? I think the future is really just being more and more sophisticated in terms of the tools that we can use, in terms of the data that we have. I think that my impression is that still most companies don't do much in terms of deeper analysis of their employee data, and I think that there's a lot of untapped potential there. And so the future, the near future at least, I think, is just more adoption of these types of methodologies and building more, more literacy and more technical proficiency in analytics within the HR function. Regarding the second part of your question, so I think that also, as I said before, there's nothing within people analytics really that is going to replace the HR, the human aspect of HR. People analytics, in my opinion, is just a tool to enrich our perspective, to give us tools in order to present data efficiently and clearly, and to maybe bring up things that we might not have thought of ourselves as human. That's maybe the main advantage that analytics has over humans, is that it can find things and problems that we don't necessarily see, things that are buried within the data, and only when you aggregate them and only when you use sophisticated methods to analyze them, then you can actually, they're brought to the surface. But the question about what is important within these results, or what are the actions that we need to take in order to address them, those I think are always going to remain human functions.
Amazing, and it sounds like it's going to be a really exciting future with people analytics playing a huge part of it. So thank you so much for everyone that joined us today. There was over 150 of us on the call, so obviously a topic that's of a lot of interest to people. And as I mentioned, we will follow up with some ideas on how you can use Bob to get going with people analytics, and we'll answer any questions that we didn't get round to, as well as sharing Adina's details with you so that you can ask any further questions you might have. So we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which we'll be sharing details on very soon. And I hope everyone has a lovely afternoon. So thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.